We do have two very, very interesting panels set for you today to close the day. The first is entitled, Are Adaptive Learning Products the Road to Achieving Personalized Learning? It's moderated by Karen Vignare. Karen is the Executive Director for the Personalized Learning Consortium at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, where she manages a network of universities committed to student success through personalization. She also oversees the Adaptive Courseware Grant, providing leadership and support to 8 pioneering universities which are scaling adaptive courseware in introductory level courses. So please welcome Karen Vignare.
Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's even a bigger pleasure to be with this panel. These are people that I completely think are really leading the field. I just learned from them. So I'd like to introduce the panelists, and I got to make sure that's my left. So I'm going to start the closest left. We have John Falchi, who is working both at the University of North Carolina system and with IMS Global, leading some of its work on the adaptive learning standards. Then we have Eric Frank, who is a VP and General Manager at Acrobatic by Vital Source. Then we have we have Kelvin, sorry. Kelvin Thompson, who's from the University of Central Florida, one of our institutions doing fabulous work with adaptive learning as well. Then we have David Wiley, co-founder of Lumen Learning, one of our great products that we are learning from, just like Acrobatic at the same time. And then we have Tracy Adkins from Georgia State University, again, another leader in the field around student success. Each of their bios can be found in the online program, so I'm not going to read their bios. That would have taken a good 10 minutes out of our short time with you. So we wanted to really get started, and we want to talk about this whole approach. So during our prep conversations, we really talked a lot about institutional change and faculty, right? So I wanted to actually start with our vendors, right? David and Eric, to let us know, how are institutions and faculty prepared? Are they ready to adopt adaptive learning? And then I'd really like to turn the tables a little bit and have the institutional and systems representatives sort of see if there's any ground there that we all agree on what's our readiness to even move forward. Eric, did you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. So not trying to start off the panel on a cantankerous note, but it's almost like asking the question, how high is up, right? There's no such thing as an institution. I think it is probably fair to say, and I think context is everything when it comes to success and personalized learning approaches, meaning it's about the teacher, it's about the student, it's about the teaching context in which they find themselves. And so that makes it even more challenging, I think, for institutions to be prepared. So I could just sort of end there, and it would be really dismal, so I won't. But I guess
where are your successes,
yeah.
right?
What I see when I do see institutions who I think are more prepared, and it's because they've been through cycles and failure, and they're learning from failure. What I do see as characteristics are something we talked about in our preparation, which is that they think of it as a framework, that they support faculty through a framework of thinking, as opposed to sort of adopting a technology or other, right? So by that I simply mean that if they encourage faculty to think hard about what is the problem that you have, or the problems that you have that are unsolved or undersolved, what's vexing you in the classroom, what is your idea about pedagogically, how would you solve that? Technology independent, like what are some of your thoughts about how you might fix that? And then let us help you evaluate technology that might enable you to do that well, and then think about how we can support you through professional development or other. How can we support you to be successful? And then I would say the last part of it is learning some patience. I think it's amazing to me that people expect to do something this hard and get it better than what they've been doing for 20 years the first time, right? You're gonna
100
fail.
years.
And so, counseling and creating a culture of failure is okay, learning is what's important, and then incrementally improving. Those are characteristics of institutional success. They're pretty few and far between, but they're real and we're early, so I'm hopeful.
Thanks, Eric. David? Are you going to tell the story about the violin?
I will tell a story about a violin. And I guess in some ways I should just say amen to what Eric just said and cede my time to my colleagues. But I think it's true, and maybe it's a little dangerous to say in this crowd, but I think it's true that training always beats technology. And so to use an analogy to a violin, if I have a $30 student rental violin and a Stradivarius, and I give the Stradivarius to somebody who's never played violin before and the $30 student instrument to somebody with an MFA in violin performance, you're going to get way better music out of the person with training with the inferior technology than you will out of somebody with the great technology but who hasn't been trained in how to use it really effectively. So I think in terms of preparation, just to echo everything Eric said, we've got to prepare faculty to be ready to use these tools effectively. You can't just drop in 50 Stradivari and expect good things to happen.
David, you guys have been working very diligently with the two-year community. Is there differences between the two-year community, and we don't have a panelist, representing the two-year community, and our four-year institutions? I mean, can you address how your company is sort of working through the different kinds of higher ed that,
Yes. Yes, there are differences. I guess the biggest difference with the two-year community is that there's just not as much institutional support for professional development, for training, for those kinds of things. And so that puts the opportunity on us to be more proactive, to be more outgoing, to be more supportive in terms of the trainings that we do, the support that we provide. Because everything I said about the violin is true, and now imagine that there are no music instructors locally. You've got to bring, that support has to come from somewhere.
So let's turn it over to our institutional representatives and ask not only that they respond to what David and Eric shared with us, but also talk about not only the internal challenges in terms of preparation and are we ready, is this going to get us on the road, but also what are the software barriers they're seeing from the adaptive companies. And I don't know, Tracy, do you want to start?
Sure. So is this one on? Because we were curious without the green light here. So I would go back to something that Eric had said and said that for Georgia State, we are continually pushing our faculty to use a model that is pilot, evaluate, and scale. Because we do want to encourage them and let them understand that you will not have success the first time out, that it is okay to continue and innovate and iterate on what you're doing in this particular area. And from what do we need from a technology and software standpoint, this isn't really a technical response, but I would say that we need our faculty to understand that their partners at the institution, their centers for teaching and learning, their technology partners need to be part of their conversations from the beginning, and not just the technology partners and the CETL staff, but our instructional designers, because we can help with some of what you've been talking about. We don't want to just walk in and say, pick a technology. Here's the deck, choose your card, and let's play. We want to talk about what is your strategy and what are you trying to solve. So we want to be the partners in this conversation. And that's not something that we're always seen as. Sometimes technology and the areas that I represent can be seen as an impediment to faculty doing what they want to do. And so we're trying to change that through conversations and encouraging faculty to work with us, and then we are providing opportunities to faculty so that they can collaborate with their peers so that we're part of the conversation at all times.
So, Kelvin, UCF has a wonderful reputation and some really good data that talks a lot about the investment you've made in faculty. right? And when it comes to adaptive, we've been thinking about these things as bringing faculty together versus training one by one. So, and you think about how you're going to scale efforts. Where are your barriers going to be at your institution?
Well, actually, just coming through, yeah. Thank you. Just to reiterate, first, I think faculty are key. I think faculty are the key stakeholders. I'm almost tempted to say faculty are the lever for change, but then that sounds very kind of othering the faculty. I think faculty are really key. So it's how do you engage faculty as, with their own agency, as Eric talked about before, how do you help faculty see a problem that they want to solve anyway? Pretty much everything we do, we try to think of from a scale standpoint. So we try to leverage our lessons learned from our successful 20-plus year history of preparing faculty for successful digital learning. And I think generally it's how do you leverage best practices, insights from research, and try to make it easy for faculty to do the right thing. Now, I do think, back to the core question that you asked, Eric and David, I think the violin thing, awesome, right? That's true. And yet, technology can either make it easier or harder to do the right thing. So wherever we can kind of lower that threshold of complexity, if you're overwhelmed from the start and you never can engage, you're like, where do I put my hand? Then that's yeah. But that's kind of what we're
So is that the way you're explaining the software?
What's
the barrier?
You don't put your hand anywhere on the software. Yeah. Where's the cup holder? Yeah. So it is a combination of technology and the human part, and supporting what we can with other specialists, right? That's all of that's part of the solution, I think, for us.
Yeah. John, you're representing both a system, University of North Carolina system, and some of the work moving forward in standards. I mean, where are our barriers, and what are we doing right from a systems approach? Or not? What do we have yet to do?
Well, I think we're still very early in the adoption phase of adaptive learning to be looking at it from a system level institutional perspective, and even looking at it from a Carnegie classification. I just don't think that we have enough adoption at that level to really start to see trends across these different Carnegie classifications. I do want to say to Eric and David, thank you from the perspective of, you led off the discussion with changes in pedagogical approach, changes in instructional strategies, and this represents, a word that's used all too often, this is a paradigm shift, and it really is. And the acknowledgement of that is very important in this process. And I'll get to the other question real fast, but I do think adaptive learning, these systems, it's a really great opportunity for instructional systems technologists to say, here is a technology that has deep learning science embedded in the tool, and we can better communicate to the faculty with this specific technology versus a learning management system, and say, here's the learning science, here's how it's designed and developed. And my point there is, part of the implementation, adoption, is the messaging. If we go to faculty and we lead off with, this is machine learning, it's great. We talked about this in an earlier session, you're dead on arrival. The other thing to keep in mind is that, well, let me back up, it was already addressed, but where do I think is lacking? I'll touch on the data perspective, right? From two perspectives. One is getting access to that walled garden, right? These platforms have tremendous data in the area of learning events, analytics, and so forth. But until we can get our hands on those data and integrate them with data elements coming from other learning technologies, we won't have this holistic understanding of the student to really get at the personalized learning understanding of where that student is in his or her mastery. The other point is, from a preparedness perspective, okay, now we have access to all the data. Do our faculty know how to use it? Right? And that's not a knock on the faculty. I mean, this is something we're all learning to how to use and how to apply it in an instructional manner. So.
Yeah, and I'd love to have the panel actually respond to that, because I know we had some great questions. We have another great panel coming up with Mike Sharkey to talk a little bit about data, but we'll stay focused on the adaptive. Do the faculty, does the institution, does the course manager know how to respond to the data? I mean, who wants to jump in with that?
Yeah, I think mostly not. And you
That's
know,
what we would actually say too. We
yeah, I
agree
mean, I
with
think
you.
it's interesting when you start having the conversation at the institutional level. The focus is on, you know, what data do you have, and what formats is it in, and how do we get it, and how does your API work, and it's like you spend all this time on this, and it was kind of like, reminds me of the days of XML and publishing, where everybody XML'd everything and never knew what they were going to do with it, so they overinvested and underutilized. That happens here all the time. I think when you get down to the faculty level, they're asking questions. What's happening in my class? Who's having a hard time in my class? Is there anything that everybody dropped the ball on since Monday and it's now Wednesday? They're very question focused, and they want data to help them answer questions. And if it doesn't, they're gonna ignore it. And if it does, and it's easy for them to do something with, we see them do stuff. So I think there's a disconnect between the institutional focus on data and the faculty wish for data that answers questions they can do something about.
David, I know you have something to say.
Don't pick on me, Karen. I know that I think as a group, I think the tools that we provide to faculty way overassume about their capabilities. Get the kinds of dashboard of lots of charts and graphs that we provide to them is kind of one step better than a CSV download. But still, there's this whole string of types of expertise that you would have to go from, you know, looking at the data to having some kind of understanding of statistics to make some interpretation of what the data are trying to tell you, translate that into some kind of learning science-based understanding of what's the principle that's at play here, translate that somehow into the instructional design of, now what would I do to affect this kind of change, and bring the disciplinary knowledge to bear at the same time. That's a team of people. That's not a single person, generally. And the kinds of tools that we're still providing, particularly with the dashboards in our systems, largely assume that somehow magically that expertise is all going to be available to you. Maybe there's a team of graduate students helping you teach their course, and you have one from each of those disciplines who can help you interpret your dashboard. We have to do better at meeting faculty, not at a place where, and I would say to Eric's point that faculty are really question-driven, that most of them still aren't. That the idea that those data would even be available to them in a fashion sufficiently timely for them to decide what to do on Wednesday is just a completely foreign idea. And introducing them to the idea that, remember, Tuesday night or Wednesday morning before you go into class, log in and look and see what's there. There's some training or acclimating or something that has to happen, because they've never been able to work in that way before. And just dropping a tool on them doesn't magically make them, you know, have those dispositions and attitudes.
Yeah, with about 1,500 faculty that are scaling adaptive learning, we are still finding that largely to be true. They're not looking at the data. In places where it's working, they are looking at the data. But it is a skill that needs to be taught over time. Before we move on, was there anything anyone from the institutions wanted to add to this conversation about faculty readiness, interpretation?
So I would say, in addition to faculty readiness, they haven't been shown how they're going to make time to actually use these dashboards and take action. So that's something that we have to account for as well. It's not just training them how to interpret them, it's talking to them about why it's important to actually make time in your day to evaluate this data, because they've never had to do it before. they typically have just walked into the classroom and begun teaching. But now we're saying, you know, there are things you have to do before you walk into that classroom.
Which has implications for how you prepare, right?
Right.
So some things have to be experienced in order to be understood. So some kind of hands-on opportunity from the faculty role, or even as a learner, you know, engaging in the process and getting practical insights, that prepares faculty rather than here's a screenshot of the dashboard and make, you know, schedule 15 minutes a day. That your results will vary.
Yeah, and I would add there's some great research. I think Titan Partners is either releasing or ready to release some work that shows this is still a sweet spot for us, guys, because the number of faculty that are aware of and using online homework systems is close to 90%, if I remember the data point. So the idea that we can help use something better and integrate it into something, I think we are on the road, you know, to having a practice that could actually change our students' performance, their ability to move forward. And I did want to shift the conversation a little bit about that, because there's a lot of great universities that attend this conference, but I do also want to stay very focused as a country, and some of this is informed by a lot of the foundation work going on, particularly driven by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around, you know, really getting the achievement gap, reducing equity, working at those foundation level courses. So this presents, I think, even yet another challenge, and I'd really like the institutions to sort of articulate how are we going to move from probably what we have right now, which is much more one section at a time being taught, to what I think some of our friends at ASU would say, you know, moving from mass customization to mass personalization, right? Like, we're not actually going to get to personalization until we scale at a level that helps us actually create some equality across sections. And I think this is where we're seeing the biggest trends in adaptive learning being used in these foundational courses. A lot of good research came out of the Next Generation courseware, which both Eric and David's companies were part of. The Next Generation courseware shows some really good data around the ability to move things forward. Not all of it is positive, by the way, and I would say that's the same for our grant. But I'd love to start with the institutions on how you begin to change the culture around the idea of, I guess we could call it academic freedom and personalization. How do we move so that we're really working to benefit our students? Because I think that's what's the core of education. And I don't know, John, I mean, I started with Tracy before. John, you want to try this one first? So you think about personalization and
Well, yeah. From an equity standpoint, one of the programs or examples that I can point to at UNC System is a program called Math Pathways. And if you're familiar with these types of programs, basically what they're doing is creating alternative pedagogical approaches to helping students along their path to attaining or completing college-level math, right? And some of these courses include requisite requirements, and a lot of this is supplemented or supported by adaptive learning. And the adaptive learning tools, we recently found out, are pretty pervasive in the system, in that we have 16 different institutions, and I think 12 or 13 of them have implemented adaptive learning to support the Math Pathways programs, and with a lot of success. And a number of system-wide grants are going out to these institutions to bolster these efforts. Now, the point towards equity, some students come in with solid math skills. Many don't, and they don't care for it. They're not going to use it in their career. They're not going to use it in their academic career, or they feel in their future. So what is that pathway to support that specific student type? And where does the adaptive learning tool provide the opportunity for equity, right? Because the academic readiness for these students is going to vary very dramatically. And the tool helps to level that playing field, at least from what we're seeing within the Math Pathways programs. Is that along what you were headed?
Yeah,
Well,
no, I don't think I have a right or wrong answer. Kelvin, did you want to?
17.2.
Wrong.
Oh, see, I just wanted to test that. Yeah, I mean, we're constantly at UCF thinking about what do we hold on to from our successful past with online and blended learning, what we might call now traditional online and blended learning, and what do we let go of as we go into adaptive. And I think today, anyway, I think that the idea of, you asked kind of a get to scale question, Karen, but I think it wrapped up in that is a culture shift thing. And I think what we've seen in the past at UCF is culture shifts one faculty member at a time in cohorts, right? So the idea of trying to balance framed effective practices with the personal preferences of the faculty member so that you're empowering and engaging, that has been really helpful for us. And you get whatever, thought leaders, opinion leaders, senior faculty engaged and our spokespersons and so forth, and you shine a bright light on their successful work, and that perpetuates. So rather than trying to think of it as a create courseware 1, create courseware 2, it's shift experientially, shift the thinking process of each member of the teaching faculty toward a culture shift in the institution. Plus, as Karen, you and I have talked about before, we don't do enough of this at UCF, but we need to make better use of commercial off-the-shelf methods that don't require from the ground up development.
Tracy?
So what we have been doing is a little bit similar to what Kelvin is describing, where we've had success in scaling personalized learning or adaptive courseware, is where we've identified faculty who have had an interest, and we build off of those faculty. And as those faculty enjoy success, hopefully, or on their next phase, their second pilot or their third pilot, and they start to find success, they start to share those stories with other faculty. So it's faculty communicating with faculty, it's that peer-to-peer relationship. And then from our perspective, we're helping to bring those faculty together and helping them to share their stories and get that information out there to the rest of the community, where we find there to still be some areas where we could improve is making sure that the academic leadership in the departments where those faculty report to are aware of what's going on and are supportive and are helping to talk to the rest of the faculty in those departments about scaling these successes out and using the same type of approach across the different sections of these courses. That's the challenge for us, and one I'm not sure how we're going to work on that one yet.
So, yeah, and I think this presents a huge challenge to our vendor partners here, because we're asking them then to work with each individual faculty, a course level approach, and the institution. So how do you deal with multiple requests if you're trying to help us, actually shift the culture inside of our own institutions? What's your approach to helping us change our culture?
I guess I'll go first this time. There's some really fascinating research out of Carnegie Mellon this past year looking at changes in teacher practice and what the obstacles to changes in teacher practice are. And I think a lot of us had an assumption, I know we certainly have, and it's one that we continue to work under, that one of the best things we can do is bring data to the table to say, here's some research we did, not just stories from faculty to faculty, although that's a very important part of it, but can we lay data underneath that as well to say, look at the increase in the passing rate. Look at the decrease in the drop rate, things like that. I had kind of a simple faith for a long time that just showing empirical results to faculty would be enough. But the research by this anthropologist at Carnegie Mellon started getting into kind of the minds and thoughts of faculty and finding that their approach to teaching is deeply connected with their identity and who they are. And the idea that here's some data showing that, what are you saying? I'm an inferior person and I need to be a better human being. It turns out to be a really difficult conversation to have. But I think if you come into that understanding that it's not just, you know what, any teaching approach is equal to any other, show me the data, I'm happy to adopt the most effective one. There are a couple of faculty like that you can find. But for a lot of them, it's a really deeply personal thing. And it takes time, and it takes conversations, it takes influence from peers, it takes seeing research results. You have to bring a lot to bear, and it's not a one-time conversation.
I think that I'll just share an interesting observation that I've had now. I started a company called Flat World Knowledge and then AcrobatIQ, and in both cases, when we looked at the data of faculty demographic analysis of who is using the software, not through our efforts, but just where it got organically adopted, it turned out to be faculty who had 20 years or more of teaching experience were the biggest adopters. It was completely the opposite of what our marketing speculation was and where we were placing our efforts. And as we dug into it a little bit, it turned out that they were the most confident in who they were as a teacher, and therefore who they were as a person, and they felt they could take risk. Yeah. They weren't, and they could operate somewhat independently of what their department chair thought of them. It wasn't a big concern, and so it's just interesting for us to start to think about how do we think differently about who those leaders may be, because I think we all experience this idea that like certain faculty always step forward. They take the initiative on these things, but then we can't spread adoption beyond, or it's really hard. It may be that we're looking in the wrong place sometime by asking the question, who wants to do this? We may be getting the people who want to do it, but can't affect others as quickly as maybe people who aren't in that normal early adopter circle. Anyway, just an observation.
Thanks, Eric. So as we get ready to wrap up, I want to hand back to the panelists. Like, they get their 30 seconds to really answer the same question that we've been trying to talk a little bit. Are adaptive learning products going to get us to a more personalized learning and better student outcomes? So John, you want to lead off?
I don't think that adaptive learning products alone will get us to personalized learning. I think if you look at the limitations of adaptive learning today, it'll get us so far from a Bloom's taxonomy perspective, meaning this system will take us through kind of the lower order knowledge creation. I think that the also missing component of that is the social component of learning. Although there are ways to handle that through an adaptive learning product, it's not the same as having that same project group working together on a given project or activity for deeper learning.
So I'll steal David's violin example because I like it. I think the students have all gathered. They got their instruments for the first time, and they're really cheap instruments, and it sounds awful. And 5 years later, you go to your 8th graders' orchestra, and it's amazing, right? It's like, wow, they're making music. So the instruments are going to get better. The players are going to get better. I think it will make a difference. It's not the only thing. It's one way to get to personalized learning and to better outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's smart. I guess I'll reframe that just a little bit and say that I don't even think personalized learning is the goal. I think the end of the day, right, my UCF colleague, Dr. Chuck Jubin, likes to talk about various affordances of digital learning are ultimately about, as he likes to put it, degrees of freedom for students. I would say opportunity, right? Especially when working with new majority student populations. So insofar as any of our digital learning opportunities, personalized learning, adaptive learning, online learning, blended learning, whatever kind of learning, can be implemented where we're giving students opportunity that they wouldn't have otherwise. So are adaptive learning products the road to achieving personalized learning? Well, maybe, it depends. Necessary but not sufficient. But again, it's not about personalized learning, it's about what are we doing for the students. And so it doesn't have to be some kind of purist hit the goal if it's some abstract personalized learning construct. It's what are we doing for the students? Let's look at the metrics there. I think that's the thing to keep in mind.
I guess I would make 2 points quickly. One is that inasmuch as the role of adaptive systems is to build up a model of the student and look at all the content and things that are available and say, here's the thing that you should do next, and try to optimize a pathway through them, through learning experiences for them. I think there's a very real risk that these systems, by taking away student agency, by making those choices on their behalf, causes their study skills to atrophy in a way that might get them some short-term gains, but could be harmful in the long term as they lose their kind of metacognitive muscle. So I think that's something we should be worried about when we talk about adaptive learning. And the second point I would make is that when you think back to the 1 or 2, or if you're a super blessed person, 3 or 4 really transformative experiences you had as a student coming up through school, it was never with a textbook. Right? You don't think back, you don't look back and say, I'm an economist because I read Mankiw, you know. It was a teacher who inspired you, who connected with you, who got you through. And so this courseware is going to play some role, but let's not pretend that it's going to have the biggest impact of all.
So I'm a parent of a 6-year-old, and she's in Georgia schools, so she's in DeKalb County schools, and she came home a few weeks ago and started describing to me what her teacher was teaching her that day and how it was different than what the other students in her class were being taught. And how when she goes to take the test in a few weeks, her test was going to be different based on what she knows and the way she's answering the questions on that test. So I realized my 6-year-old was describing to me adaptive learning or personalized learning. So the students will be coming to us soon, and they will have had these experiences. And I think, while I'm not sure that adaptive learning products as they are today are going to lead to personalized learning, some iteration of them, of this will, and we have to be prepared for it because those students are coming to us, and they already know about personalized learning. They're describing it from first grade.
Thank you. We want to turn our time over to the next panel, and we appreciate you guys being listeners, and thanks to my panelists.